Dark psychology secrets. They don't want you to know. Chapter 1. The real battlefield. Attention, trust, and the nervous system. Most books about dark psychology begin with villains. They talk about narcissists, sociopaths, master manipulators, cult leaders. They focus on personality. That is the first mistake. Dark psychology is not primarily about personality. It is about systems. The real battlefield is not your mind in the abstract. It is your attention, your trust calibration, and your nervous system regulation. Whoever can influence these three layers does not need to overpower your logic. They simply BYP. Acid, the collapse of the old model. For decades, influence was studied as persuasion. Researchers examined rhetoric, argument strength, credibility, repetition, and authority cues. The assumption was simple. If a message is strong enough, people will accept it. But modern influence has shifted from persuasion to cognitive load manipulation. Recent behavioral science shows that decision quality declines sharply when cognitive load increases. Under stress or information overload, the prefrontal cortex reduces its regulatory control. When this happens, humans rely more heavily on heuristics, mental shortcuts. This means influence today is less about convincing you something is true. It is about exhausting your capacity to evaluate truth. That shift changes everything. Dark influence no longer asks, "How do I prove this?" It asks, "How do I reduce their verification BA?" And with attention is the entry point. Attention is not passive. It is a limited biological resource. Neuroscience shows that attentional networks compete for dominance. The more emotionally charged a stimulus is, the more likely it captures attentional priority. This is why outrage spreads faster than nuance. This is why urgency beats accuracy. This is why fear converts faster than logic. If someone can control what you attend to, they control what you consider real. Influence begins by narrowing your field of perception. Once your field narrows, your interpretation narrows. Once interpretation narrows, your options narrow. This is not mind control. It is environmental control. Trust is a shortcut mechanism. Trust is not moral. Trust is efficient. Humans evolved to trust because constant verification is metabolically expensive. If you had to verify every statement in your tribe thousands of years ago, you would not survive long. So the brain developed trust heuristics. Signals such as confidence, familiarity, social proof, shared identity, and authority markers accelerate trust formation. Dark operators do not convince. They simulate trust signals. They manufacture familiarity. They mirror speech patterns. They borrow status from recognizable institutions. They create artificial consensus. And once trust is granted, scrutiny drops dramatically. The critical insight here is this. Trust does not require truth. It requires coherence. If a message feels internally consistent and socially validated, most people stop digging. The nervous system override. The third layer is the most powerful. The nervous system. Influence becomes exponentially stronger when the target's autonomic nervous system is activated. When stress increases, cortisol rises. When fear spikes, adrenaline increases. When desire intensifies, dopamine rises. Under high arousal, humans shift from analytical processing to survival processing. This is why urgency works. This is why scarcity works. This is why sexualization works. This is why public shaming works. These tactics hijack physiology. Once the body is activated, the mind rationalizes the action afterward. Many people believe they made a conscious choice. In reality, their body made the decision first. The innovation most people miss. Here is where modern dark psychology becomes more sophisticated. It no longer needs to manipulate individuals directly. It manipulates environments. Algorithms amplify emotional content. Social platforms reward reaction over reflection. Information velocity outpaces verification speed. The result is continuous low-grade arousal. Not panic, not trauma, but constant stimulation. When the nervous system never fully returns to baseline, cognitive resilience drops, and a person in a chronically stimulated state becomes easier to steer. This is not conspiracy thinking. It is systems design interacting with human biology. The environment does not need to lie to you. It only needs to keep you slightly dysregulated. Why intelligence does not protect you. Many people assume that being smart makes them resistant. Research suggests otherwise. High intelligence does not eliminate bias. It often increases confidence in biased reasoning. When under emotional activation, even highly intelligent individuals rely on identity protective cognition. They defend beliefs aligned with their tribe rather than reevaluating evidence. In other words, intelligence improves your ability to defend a position. It does not guarantee you chose a position freely. Dark psychology exploits identity. Why attachment more than ignorance? The core formula. Modern dark influence follows a predictable sequence. Capture attention. Simulate trust. Elevate arousal. Reduce verification time. Offer a simple action. The action can be small. Click, agree, share, send, join, stay silent. Every small action reinforces identity. An ID, entity once formed, resists contradiction, the first defense of insight. If attention, trust, and nervous system regulation are the battlefield, then defense is not about arguing better. It is about managing state. A calm nervous system thinks better. A regulated mind verifies more. A slow decision reduces manipulation risk. The first chapter is not about becoming cynical. It is about becoming aware that influence in 2026 is less about words and more about bandwidth. You are not losing arguments. You are losing processing capacity. And the person who controls your processing capacity does not need to control your thoughts. They only need to control your timing. Chapter 2. Cognitive Security. Why Believability Defeated Truth. For most of human history, truth and survival were closely linked. If you misjudged reality, you paid quickly. If you trusted the wrong person, consequences were immediate. Reality corrected error. That is no longer the case. Today, a statement does not need to be true to shape behavior. It only needs to be believable long enough to produce action. This is the era where believability outperforms accuracy. To understand this shift, you need to understand something uncomfortable. The human brain does not evaluate information by asking, "Is this true?" It asks, "Does this fit? Does it fit my prior beliefs? Does it fit my emotional state? Does it fit my tribe? Does it fit the story I already live inside?" Cognitive security is the ability to protect your mental environment from distortions that feel coherent but are not verified. Most people do not possess this skill because it was never formally taught. We were taught critical thinking in theory, but not defensive cognition in practice. The brain is a prediction engine. It constantly generates models of the world and updates them based on incoming data. However, updating requires energy. When the nervous system is stressed or overstimulated, the brain shifts from updating mode to defending mode. instead of adjusting beliefs. It protects them. This creates a vulnerability. Modern influence does not fight your logic. It feeds your existing model. It reinforces your identity. It strengthens what you already suspect. When information confirms a belief, the brain releases a small reward signal. The signal feels like clarity. It feels like validation. It feels like insight, but often it is just reinforcement. Believability thrives on emotional coherence. If a message aligns with how you already feel, you will experience it as true, even before you evaluate it. That is why emotionally charged narratives outperform balanced analysis. That is why outrage spreads faster than nuance. That is why dramatic claims gain traction while cautious ones fade. The mind prefers resolution over accuracy. Another factor accelerates this process: speed. Verification takes time. Belief is immediate. The moment you encounter a statement, your brain forms a provisional interpretation. That interpretation becomes a default. Later corrections must fight against it. Studies on misinformation have shown that even when false claims are debunked, the original impression often lingers. The correction does not fully erase the cognitive trace. This is called the continued influence effect. It reveals something profound. Once an idea is integrated into your mental model, removing it is more difficult than inserting it. Dark psychology leverages this asymmetry. Instead of persuading slowly, it implants quickly. It relies on repetition, emotional triggers, and social reinforcement. By the time doubt arises, the belief already feels familiar, and familiarity is one of the strongest predictors of perceived truth. Repetition increases perceived validity. This is known as the illusory truth effect. When you hear something repeatedly, even without evidence, your brain begins to process it more fluently. Fluency feels like truth, not because it is accurate, because it is easy. Cognitive security requires slowing down that fluency response. It requires asking not only whether something feels right, but why it feels right. Another overlooked vulnerability is identity protective reasoning. When information threatens a core identity marker, whether political, social, moral, or personal, the brain activates defensive mechanisms. You do not evaluate the claim neutrally. You evaluate it as a threat. Under threat, reasoning becomes strategic. You search for arguments to preserve identity, not to discover reality. This explains why highly intelligent individuals can hold contradictory beliefs. Intelligence enhances the ability to rationalize. It does not eliminate bias. In fact, stronger cognitive ability sometimes increases polarization. Skilled thinkers become skilled defenders of their existing worldview. Believability wins because it integrates seamlessly with identity. Truth often requires discomfort. Believability offers emotional safety. Modern information ecosystems amplify this dynamic. Algorithms prioritize engagement. Engagement correlates with emotional intensity. Emotional intensity narrows perception. Narrow perception reduces complexity. Reduced complexity strengthens conviction. The result is a feedback loop. You are exposed to emotionally resonant information. You react. The system shows you more of the same. Your worldview becomes more internally consistent. External contradiction appears hostile or irrational. Inside that loop, truth becomes secondary. What matters is internal coherence. Cognitive security, then, is not about skepticism alone. It is about maintaining the capacity to tolerate uncertainty. It is about resisting the urge to close the loop prematurely. The most dangerous moment in modern influence is not confusion. It is certainty. Certainty feels powerful. It reduces anxiety. It simplifies the world. It gives you a role inside a narrative. But premature certainty is often manufactured. Dark operators understand that people do not crave facts. They crave stability. If you provide a simple, emotionally satisfying explanation for complex events, you'll gain traction faster than someone offering nuanced uncertainty. The question becomes this: how do you protect your cognition in an environment designed to accelerate belief? First, you separate speed from accuracy. If something feels urgent, you increase delay. Urgency is one of the most reliable tools used to suppress verification. When time pressure rises, scrutiny falls. Second, you interrogate emotional resonance. When a claim triggers strong anger, fear, or pride, you treat that emotional spike as a signal to pause rather than a signal to act. Third, you diversify input. Cognitive security weakens in homogeneous environments. When all sources reinforce the same narrative, the illusion of consensus grows. Exposure to credible disagreement strengthens mental flexibility. Fourth, you examine incentives. Every message has a direction. Someone benefits if you believe it. The benefit may be financial, social, ideological, or reputational. Identifying incentive structures clarifies motive. Finally, you practice cognitive humility. This is not weakness. It is resilience. The ability to say, "I do not yet know," protects you from force alignment. Believability defeated truth not because truth disappeared, but because speed, emotion, and identity began to dominate processing. Dark psychology in this era does not need to invent elaborate lies. It needs only to exploit your natural cognitive shortcuts. The battlefield is not intelligence versus deception. It is regulation versus reactivity. If you master your state, you regain time. If you regain time, you regain evaluation. If you regain evaluation, believability loses its advantage. And once believability loses its advantage, truth has a chance to compete again. Chapter 3: Pre-bunking, the psychological vaccine. Most people never receive. There is a reason most people lose the battle against manipulation before they even realize a battle has started. They prepare defenses after exposure. But by the time falsehood, distortion, or engineered narrative reaches conscious awareness, it has already passed through perception, emotion, and identity filters. It has already left a trace. The mind is easier to protect before contamination than to cleanse after. This is where pre-bunking enters. Pre-bunking is not debunking. Debunking reacts. Pre-bunking anticipates. Instead of correcting misinformation after it spreads, pre-bunking exposes people in advance to weakened versions of manipulation techniques, so they can recognize a pattern when the real version appears. The concept originates from inoculation theory in psychology. Just as the immune system becomes stronger after exposure to a harmless fragment of a virus, cognition becomes more resistant when it understands the mechanics of deception before encountering it at scale. The innovation here is not simply awareness. It is pattern recognition. Most people try to memorize facts. Manipulators study patterns. If you memorize facts, you defend against specific claims. If you recognize patterns, you defend against entire strategies. Consider how modern distortion works. It often follows a structure. Introduce a grain of truth. Attach emotional amplification. Frame the issue as urgent or morally charged. Simplify complexity into a binary. Encourage immediate action. If you understand that structure before exposure, your brain tags it as familiar when it appears. Familiarity, in this context, does not increase belief. It increases skepticism. Research in cognitive science has shown that brief training sessions teaching people the common tactics of misinformation significantly reduce susceptibility later. Even a few minutes of structured exposure can build measurable resistance. This is profound. It means resilience does not require encyclopedic knowledge. It requires structural literacy. Dark psychology thrives on asymmetry. The manipulator studies influence professionally. The target does not study defense. Pre-bunking closes at asymmetry. But here is the deeper layer most discussions ignore. Pre-bunking is not only about misinformation. It applies to interpersonal dynamics, workplace politics, romantic entanglements, and leadership structures. If you know in advance that flattery can be used as a compliance tool, you experience praise differently. If you know that urgency can suppress reasoning, you feel time pressure differently. If you know that public agreement increases private commitment, you treat small verbal alignments more carefully. Awareness changes internal response patterns, and response patterns determine vulnerability. One of the most powerful pre-bunking techniques involves teaching people about emotional triggers before they are triggered. For example, imagine you're told in advance that during times of uncertainty, narratives promising simple solutions will feel unusually attractive. When crisis emerges, your mind already has a label for that attraction. Instead of thinking, "This explanation feels right," you think, "This explanation feels relieving." That distinction matters. Relief is not evidence. Clarity is not proof. Another overlooked dimension of pre-bunking involves identity defense. When people understand that their identity can be exploited, they become less reactive when it is challenged. Instead of interpreting disagreement as attack, they interpret as potential manipulation of tribal instincts. The nervous system stays more regulated, and regulation preserves evaluation. Modern systems rarely encourage pre-bunking because it reduces emotional volatility. Emotional volatility drives engagement. Engagement drives metrics. Metrics drive profit. But long-term cognitive stability depends on anticipatory awareness. Pre-bunking does not mean becoming paranoid. It does not mean assuming every message is malicious. It means understanding the toolkit so thoroughly that the tools lose their invisibility. The most effective manipulation is the one you do not see as manipulation. Once seen, its power diminishes. There is also a paradox. Teaching manipulation techniques irresponsibly can increase misuse. Teaching them ethically increases defense. The difference lies in framing. When techniques are presented as power to dominate others, they attract those seeking control. When presented as anatomy of exploitation, they attract those seeking autonomy. The goal of pre-bunking is autonomy. To achieve autonomy, 3 shifts must occur. First, move from content analysis to tactic analysis. Instead of asking, "Is this claim correct?" also ask, "What technique is being used?" Second, separate emotional intensity from informational value. The louder the emotional tone, the slower your response should become. Third, normalize delayed judgment. There is strength in withholding immediate alignment. Silence protects cognition. Pre-bunking works because it transforms a prize into recognition. Manipulation relies on novelty. It relies on the brain being caught off guard. When the pattern is anticipated, the shock diminishes, and shock is fuel. Without shock, urgency weakens. Without urgency, scrutiny returns. Without scrutiny collapse, influence loses acceleration. The deeper truth is this: cognitive immunity is not built in moments of crisis. It is built in moments of calm. You cannot develop resistance while emotionally flooded. You develop it before. The people most difficult to manipulate are not the most cynical. They are the most pattern aware. They understand that influence is constant. They accept that persuasion is everywhere. And because they expect it, they are not destabilized by its presence. Pre-bunking gives you psychological antibodies. It does not make you invulnerable, but it makes you expensive to deceive. And in an environment optimized for speed, becoming expensive to deceive is one of the most radical acts of independence available. Chapter 4. Synthetic reality, when seeing and hearing are no longer proof. For most of human history, perception was authority. If you saw it, it existed. If you heard it, it happened. If someone spoke with confidence in your presence, you trusted the signal. That foundation is dissolving. We are entering a phase where perception itself can be engineered, not edited, not distorted, engineered from scratch. Synthetic media, deepfake video, clone voices, AI-generated imagery, does not merely alter information, it alters the evidence layer of reality. And that changes the rules of influence permanently. In earlier eras, deception required proximity or physical fabrication, a forged document, a staged photograph, a rehearsed lie. Today, a believable face can be generated without a camera. A convincing voice can be cloned without the speaker's awareness. A conversation can be simulated that never occurred. The mind evolved in an environment where sensory signals were difficult to fake. Now, those signals are programmable. This creates a psychological fracture. The human brain assigns higher credibility to audio-visual material than to text. When you hear tone, see facial expression, and observe micro-movements, your trust circuits activate more quickly. Mirror neurons respond. Emotional contagion strengthens belief. Synthetic media exploits that bias. The most dangerous aspect is not that fake videos exist. It is that the mere possibility of fabrication erodes shared certainty. When any video can be questioned, trust in authentic evidence declines. This phenomenon is sometimes referred to as a liar's dividend. If convincing fakes exist, real footage can be dismissed as fake. Reality becomes negotiable. Once reality becomes negotiable, influence shifts from proving facts to shaping perception of plausibility. This is not a technical problem alone. It is a psychological one. Humans rely on perceptual anchors to stabilize belief. When anchors weaken, anxiety increases. In anxious environments, people search for authoritative narratives to reduce uncertainty. Those narratives do not need to be accurate. They need to feel stabilizing. Synthetic reality increases instability. Instability increases the hunger for strong interpretation. Strong interpretation often comes from individuals who speak with certainty rather than nuance. Thus, the more unstable perception becomes, the more appealing confident voices become. Confidence becomes currency. Another layer of this shift involves cognitive fatigue. When individuals are repeatedly exposed to warnings about misinformation, deepfakes, and manipulation, a paradox emerges. They begin to distrust everything. But constant distrust is exhausting. Eventually, people revert to heuristic shortcuts again. They begin to trust selectively based on identity alignment. In other words, when verification becomes too demanding, tribal affiliation replaces evidence evaluation. This is the hidden danger. Synthetic reality does not merely create false content. It overloads verification capacity. An overload drives simplification. There's also a biological dimension. The human nervous system reacts to realistic audio-visual cues almost automatically. Even if you intellectually know a video might be fake, Your body still responds to the tone of voice, the urgency, the fear, and facial expression. Emotion precedes cognition. If a synthetic voice sounds distressed, your empathy activates. If a video depicts urgency, your stress system activates. By the time you question authenticity, physiological response has already influenced interpretation. Manipulation increasingly operates at that pre-rational layer. The innovation here is not about technology alone. It is about timing and scale. Synthetic content can be produced rapidly, distributed globally, and tailored to specific audiences. Micro-targeted synthetic persuasion becomes possible. This means two individuals can experience entirely different realities, each supported by apparently authentic evidence. Shared consensus fractures. When consensus fractures, power shifts toward those who control narrative framing, rather than those who provide verification. The deeper issue is epistemic fatigue. Epistemology concerns how we know what we know. When individuals lose confidence in their ability to determine truth, they experience a subtle cognitive withdrawal. They stop engaging deeply. They defer to influencers, leaders, or communities to interpret events for them. Delegated thinking increases vulnerability. The future of dark psychology is not about convincing you of one lie. It is about exhausting your will to investigate. When investigation feels futile, belief becomes convenience. There is, however, a counterintuitive defense. It is not hyperskepticism. Hyperskepticism collapses trust entirely and increases anxiety. The defense is layered verification. Instead of asking, "Is this real?" ask, "What independent sources confirm this?" Instead of reacting to a single clip, search for context. Instead of trusting a viral fragment, seek full sequences. Slowing down restores agency. Another crucial shift involves separating emotional response from authenticity assessment. If a piece of content produces immediate fear or outrage, that is precisely the moment to increase delay. Urgency is often engineered. Synthetic influence thrives on immediacy. Defense thrives on pause. But the most profound defense is internal stability. When your nervous system is regulated, you are less reactive to visual shock. When you are not chronically overstimulated, dramatic stimuli have less leverage. Stability reduces susceptibility. The unsettling truth is that perception can no longer serve as absolute proof. The eye and ear are no longer final authorities. This does not mean truth disappears. It means verification becomes multi-layered. The future belongs to individuals who cultivate cognitive patience, those who resist immediate alignment, those who tolerate ambiguity without surrendering to narrative certainty. Synthetic reality is not the end of truth. It is the end of effortless truth. And in a world where perception can be manufactured, discernment becomes a survival skill. Chapter 5. Coercive control, when manipulation disguises itself as care. The most dangerous forms of manipulation do not look aggressive. They look protective, supportive, loyal, concerned. Coercive control is not about explosive domination. It is about gradual restriction disguised as care. It does not begin with commands. It begins with attention. Someone studies your vulnerabilities, your insecurities, your ambitions, your fears of abandonment, your desire to be understood. Then they position themselves as a solution. Unlike obvious manipulation, coercive control works through dependency architecture. It restructures your environment slowly so that leaving becomes psychologically expensive. At first, the dynamic feels stabilizing. They offer guidance. They provide reassurance. They defend you from critics. They encourage loyalty. But beneath this surface, a pattern develops. Isolation increases. Autonomy decreases. External perspectives are reframed as threats. Independent decision-making subtly weakens. Coercive control thrives on incremental shifts. There is rarely a dramatic turning point. Instead, there are small adjustments that accumulate. A comment questioning your friend's loyalty. A suggestion that certain colleagues do not understand you. A reminder that only they truly support your growth. Each instance feels minor, but patterns shape perception. Over time, your social circle narrows. Alternative viewpoints become suspect. Your internal compass begins to recalibrate around one primary source of validation. This is the architecture of dependency. Research on coercive dynamics in relationships shows that overt violence is often preceded by psychological restriction. Control over finances, social access, information flow, and emotional validation emerges gradually. But coercive control is not limited to romantic partnerships. It appears in leadership structures, high-control organizations, mentorships, and even online communities. The mechanism is consistent. First, create emotional exclusivity. Then create conditional approval. Then create subtle consequences for deviation. Conditional approval is especially powerful. Approval becomes currency. Silence becomes punishment. Disagreement becomes betrayal. Humans are deeply sensitive to social rejection. Neuroimaging studies show that social exclusion activates pain pathways similar to physical injury. When approval is withdrawn, distress rises quickly. A skilled controller does not need to shout. They withdraw warmth. The target responds by self-correcting. Self-correction is the key. When individuals begin policing their own thoughts to maintain connection, control becomes internalized. External pressure is no longer required. The system sustains itself. Another tactic involves reframing autonomy as selfishness. If you seek independence, you are accused of disloyalty. If you question authority, you are labeled ungrateful. If you set boundaries, you are portrayed as cold. The manipulator presents themselves as wounded rather than controlling. This inversion creates confusion. You begin defending yourself instead of evaluating the dynamic. Gaslighting often accompanies coercive control, not the exaggerated version portrayed in media, but subtle destabilization. Memories are questioned. Interpretations are minimized. Concerns are labeled overreactions. Over time, confidence in your own perception weakens. When perception weakens, reliance increases. The most insidious element of coercive control is that it rarely feels like control at first. It feels like alignment, shared language, shared values, shared enemies. The manipulator creates an us versus them narrative. Unity strengthens. External criticism becomes proof of persecution. The more others express concern, the more tightly the bond reinforces itself. This creates a psychological trap. Leaving does not feel like freedom. It feels like betrayal. The nervous system becomes conditioned. Approval triggers relief. Disapproval triggers anxiety. The body learns a pattern before the mind fully articulates it. That conditioning makes rational exit difficult. Why does coercive control succeed? Because humans crave certainty and belonging. In uncertain environments, a strong central figure or tightly bonded group provides clarity. That clarity feels stabilizing. The cost is often invisible at first. Loss of independent judgment, loss of diverse input, loss of spontaneous authenticity. Eventually, the individual's world becomes smaller. One way to detect coercive patterns early is to monitor range. Healthy dynamics expand your world. They increase connections, options, and perspectives. Controlling dynamics shrink your world. They limit exposure, narrow relationships, and centralize authority. Expansion is a sign of strength. Restriction disguised as safety is a warning. Another signal involves emotional volatility tied to approval. If your sense of stability fluctuates dramatically based on one person's validation, dependency is forming. Dependency is not inherently unhealthy, but when it becomes asymmetric, when one individual controls access to belonging, vulnerability increases. The defense against coercive control is not hostility, it is structural awareness. Maintain multiple sources of input. Preserve financial and emotional autonomy. Observe patterns rather than isolated incidents. Notice whether questioning is welcomed or punished. Healthy power does not fear scrutiny. Coercive power depends on it being uncomfortable. The most profound insight about coercive control is this: it does not require cruelty. It requires gradual constraint. When constraint becomes normalized, resistance feels irrational. Dark psychology often hides in extremes. Coercive control hides in moderation. It moves slowly. It justifies itself. It calls it self-protection. And by the time it becomes obvious, the exit cost feels high. Understanding the pattern early makes you harder to enclose. Awareness widens your range. Range restores choice. Choice restores autonomy. Chapter 6. The Dark Triad in the Real World. When systems reward the traits we fear. When people hear the phrase dark triad, they imagine extreme personalities. A narcissist obsessed with admiration. A Machiavellian strategist manipulating from the shadows. A psychopath without empathy. The mistake is assuming these traits only exist in dramatic individuals. In reality, the traits associated with the dark triad often thrive not because individuals are evil, but because certain systems reward them. The dark triad refers to 3 personality dimensions: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Each involves different tendencies. Narcissism centers on grandiosity and the need for admiration. Machiavellianism focuses on strategic manipulation and long-term calculation. Psychopathy involves impulsivity, low empathy, and emotional detachment. In isolation, these traits can be destructive, but in competitive environments, some features of these traits are selectively reinforced. Confidence can be mistaken for competence. Emotional detachment can appear as decisiveness. Strategic manipulation can look like leadership skill. Systems that prioritize short-term results often elevate individuals who project certainty, suppress doubt, and make rapid decisions without emotional hesitation. That projection is powerful. Humans are wired to interpret confidence as capability. Even when accuracy does not correlate with certainty, we instinctively gravitate toward those who appear sure. In high-stakes environments, hesitation is penalized. Reflection can be perceived as weakness. Individuals high in narcissistic or psychopathic traits often experience less anxiety in such contexts. Lower emotional reactivity can provide an advantage under pressure. The system does not necessarily reward cruelty. It rewards output. If a person can achieve measurable outcomes quickly, the interpersonal cost may be overlooked, at least temporarily. This creates a subtle normalization. Traits that might be alarming in intimate settings become functional in competitive arenas. Machiavellian traits, in particular, align closely with strategic environments. High Machiavellian individuals are often patient, observant, and skilled at reading power structures. They adapt to hierarchy effectively and conceal long-term intentions. In corporate, political, or media ecosystems, this adaptability can translate into upward mobility. But here is the deeper layer. The system amplifies certain behaviors, and then those behaviors reshape the culture. If aggressive self-promotion leads to visibility, others adopt similar strategies. If emotional detachment correlates with perceived strength, vulnerability declines. If narrative control outperforms transparency, authenticity erodes. Gradually, the environment selects for individuals comfortable operating without full emotional integration. This does not mean every leader is dark. It means selection pressures matter. Research has shown that individuals high in dark triad traits can be disproportionately represented in positions of authority, especially in environments with low accountability and high reward for dominance. However, there is an important nuance. Dark traits exist on a spectrum. Mild narcissism can increase ambition and resilience. Measured emotional detachment can improve crisis management. Strategic thinking can protect against exploitation. The issue is not the presence of these traits. It is the absence of constraint. When systems lack transparency, feedback loops weaken. When accountability mechanisms fail, individuals high in exploitative traits experience fewer consequences. Over time, this distorts organizational ethics. The public often asks, how did this person rise to power? The answer is often less dramatic than imagined. They adapted to incentives. Dark psychology in systemic context is less about secret manipulation and more about alignment with reward structures. If attention economy platforms reward outrage, individuals comfortable with provocation rise. If political systems reward polarization, individuals skilled at tribal activation gain influence. If corporate metrics prioritize quarterly gains over long-term sustainability, short-term strategists dominate. The traits are not floating independently. They are responding to incentives. Another overlooked dimension is impression management. Individuals high in dark triad traits often excel at curating image. They understand that perception can override substance, at least initially. They manage optics carefully, presenting charm when advantageous and detachment when necessary. Charm is not warmth, it is calibration. When charm is paired with strategic intent, influence increases rapidly, but there is a cost. Environments saturated with dark adaptive behavior experience trust erosion. When people suspect strategic manipulation behind every interaction, collaboration declines. Innovation suffers because psychological safety weakens. Long-term stability requires trust. Short-term acceleration can be achieved through dominance. The tension between these two forces shapes modern institutions. The crucial insight is this: demonizing individuals misses the structural problem. If you remove one person with exploitative traits but keep the same incentive architecture, similar personalities will emerge again. Dark psychology becomes sustainable when it is systemically reinforced. Defense, therefore, is not only personal, it is structural. Organizations must align incentives with ethical transparency. Feedback must be protected. Dissent must be safe. Evaluation must include long-term relational cost, not only immediate output. On the individual level, awareness matters. Recognize the difference between confidence and competence. Distinguish decisiveness from impulsivity. Observe whether empathy is present when power increases. Healthy leadership expands others' capacity. Dark adaptive leadership centralizes power. One final nuance is essential. People are not fixed archetypes. Traits fluctuate under stress. High-pressure environments can temporarily increase narcissistic or detached behavior, even in individuals not predisposed to it. Systemic stress amplifies shadow traits. Therefore, reducing chronic stress within institutions is not only a wellness strategy, it is a character preservation strategy. When pressure intensifies, survival traits surface. If we design environments that reward only survival, we should not be surprised when empathy declines. The dark triad in the real world is less about villains and more about feedback loops. Traits meet incentives. Incentives shape culture. Culture determines which traits rise. Understanding this breaks the illusion that dark psychology is rare. It is often embedded, but once seen, incentive structures can be redesigned. And redesigning incentives is far more powerful than hunting personalities. Chapter 7. The Empathy Exploit. How good people become easy targets. Most people assume that strength protects them from manipulation. In reality, some most frequently exploited individuals are not weak. They are empathetic. They are conscientious. They are responsible. They are emotionally attuned. And precisely because of these qualities, they can be predictable. Dark psychology does not always search for the insecure or the ignorant. It often searches for the morally motivated. Empathy is one of humanity's greatest assets. It allows cooperation, bonding, and collective survival. But empathy is also a leverage point. When someone understands that you are deeply uncomfortable causing harm, disappointing others, or appearing selfish, they can shape your behavior without overt force. The manipulation does not begin with aggression. It begins with appeal to your fairness, appeal to your compassion, appeal to your desire to be seen as reasonable. You are not pressured. You are invited. The mechanism works through guilt anticipation. Empathetic individuals simulate the emotional consequences of refusal. Before they say no, they imagine the other person's disappointment, frustration, or pain. That imagined discomfort often feels worse than the cost of compliance. So they agree. Over time, this creates a pattern. The empathetic individual becomes a stabilizer in every dynamic. They smooth conflict. They carry extra responsibility. They absorb tension. The manipulator does not need to demand. They only need to express distress. Distress becomes currency. There is a subtle shift that occurs when empathy becomes unilateral. In balanced relationships, empathy flows both directions. In exploitive dynamics, empathy flows one way. The empathetic person adjusts repeatedly. The other rarely does. But because the empathetic individual values harmony, they interpret imbalance as their own failure to understand, rather than as a structural problem. This self-blame loop deepens vulnerability. Another tactic used in empathy exploitation is moral reframing. Requests are framed not as preferences, but as ethical necessities. If you cared, you would. If you were really supportive, a good partner would. A loyal team member should. The request becomes a moral test. Empathetic individuals are particularly sensitive to moral identity. They want alignment between values and action. When their integrity feels questioned, they act quickly to restore it. The manipulator understands this and introduces ambiguity. They do not accuse directly. They imply. Implied accusation is powerful because it leaves room for self-correction. The empathetic target fills the gap. There is also a neurological component. When empathetic individuals witness or imagine suffering, mirror systems in the brain activate. The emotional simulation is not abstract. It feels real. The manipulator's visible discomfort triggers internal discomfort in the target. Compliance relieves both. Relief reinforces the pattern. Over time, the empathetic individual becomes conditioned to associate saying yes with internal calm. Saying no becomes associated with anxiety. This is not weakness. It is conditioning. The deeper vulnerability lies in the fear of becoming the villain in someone else's story. Empathetic people want to be fair. They want to be understood. They want to avoid causing unnecessary harm. A manipulator may subtly construct narratives where refusal equals cruelty. You're abandoning me. You're overreacting. You're too cold. The empathetic person then attempts to correct the perception. Correction requires further compliance. Another dimension of the empathy exploit involves boundary erosion through gratitude. The manipulator occasionally provides support, kindness, or validation. The empathetic person feels indebted. When a request follows, refusal feels ungrateful. Reciprocity is a powerful social norm. When used ethically, it strengthens connection. When weaponized, it creates obligation. Empathy does not require submission, but without boundaries, it can drift there. One of the most dangerous misconceptions is that being kind protects you from exploitation. Kindness without boundaries increases exposure. Healthy empathy includes self-protection. It distinguishes between understanding someone's feelings and assuming responsibility for regulating them. The critical distinction is this: compassion does not require compliance. You can care without conceding. You can understand without agreeing. You can acknowledge pain without absorbing it. Exploitative dynamics blur that distinction intentionally. They merge empathy with obligation. To defend against the empathy exploit, observe reciprocity patterns. Are adjustments mutual? Is accountability shared? Does the other person tolerate your discomfort or only their own? Another defense is discomfort tolerance. If you cannot tolerate someone else's disappointment, you become easier to steer. Learning to sit with temporary disapproval strengthens autonomy. Disappointment is not abuse. Guilt is not always evidence of wrongdoing. Empathy must be paired with discernment. Discernment asks, is this request aligned with my values, or am I responding to emotional pressure? When discernment is active, empathy becomes strength again. Without discernment, empathy becomes leverage. Dark psychology does not always attack your flaws. Sometimes it studies your virtues. The more predictable your goodness, the easier it becomes to script your response. But when empathy is grounded in self-respect, the script breaks. And when the script breaks, coercion loses its subtle power. Chapter 8: Status Hacking, Borrowed Authority and Manufactured Credibility. Power rarely announces itself honestly. It signals a title, a setting, a tone of voice, a visual backdrop, a subtle association with something already trusted. Status hacking is a strategic construction of perceived authority without equivalent substance. It does not require lying directly. It requires arranging signals. Humans evolved in hierarchical environments. Quickly identifying status had survival value. Higher status individuals often controlled resources, protection, and information. The brain therefore developed rapid status detection mechanisms. Clothing, posture, vocal confidence, symbols of affiliation, and environmental cues trigger unconscious evaluation. These evaluations occur before analytical thought. When a person appears authoritative, cognitive resistance drops. We assume competence first and verify later, if at all. Status hacking exploits this shortcut. One method is borrowed authority. This involves proximity signaling, standing next to influential figures, referencing well-known institutions, displaying logos, certificates, or awards prominently, using language that implies insider access. The individual does not need to claim expertise directly. They imply adjacency to expertise. Association substitutes for proof. Another method involves environmental staging. A clean studio, bookshelves in the background, professional lighting, confident pacing. These elements activate cultural scripts. The viewer's brain matches a scene with familiar authority archetypes: professor, executive, expert, commentator. The perception forms quickly. Even when viewers believe they are evaluating content rationally, they are influenced by aesthetic coherence. Coherence increases credibility. Status hacking also uses linguistic calibration. Certain speech patterns project certainty, fewer hesitations, lower vocal pitch, strategic pauses, declarative statements instead of conditional phrasing. Research in social psychology has shown that confidence significantly impacts perceived expertise. Even when accuracy does not improve, people prefer confident explanations over hesitant but more accurate ones. Certainty feels stabilizing. Manipulators understand this. They reduce qualifiers. They eliminate ambiguity in their tone. They speak in frameworks, not possibilities. Structure mimics mastery. Another powerful tactic is exclusivity framing. This is what insiders know. They don't want you to understand this. Only a few people are aware. Exclusivity increases perceived value. When information feels restricted, it appears more important. Scarcity and secrecy amplify status. Ironically, the claim of being censored can function as a status signal. If someone suggests they are suppressed by powerful forces, they elevate themselves symbolically. Opposition implies importance. Status is also hacked through numbers, follower counts, view metrics, testimonials, screenshots of revenue or influence. Large numbers activate social proof. If many people follow, the brain infers credibility. The evaluation shortcut becomes popularity equals validity. This is not always rational. Collective judgment can be informative, but when numbers are inflated, curated, or strategically displayed without context, perception is distorted. Status hacking does not always fabricate data. It often selects selectively, highlight successes, minimize failures, display endorsements without disclosing relationships. Curated transparency feels authentic while controlling narrative. Another dimension involves symbolic dominance, subtle dismissiveness toward critics, confident reframing of objections, unapologetic assertion. Dominance cues often increase perceived competence, especially in uncertain environments. During instability, people gravitate toward figures who project control. Control signals safety, but projection of control is not evidence of competence. The deeper danger of status hacking lies in internalization. Once someone is perceived as high status, confirmation bias strengthens. Followers interpret ambiguous behavior favorably. Mistakes are reframed as strategy. Criticism is seen as jealousy or misunderstanding. Perceived authority reshapes interpretation. The individual no longer needs to prove credibility repeatedly. The perception sustains itself. How do you defend against status manipulation? First, separate signal from substance. Ask what evidence supports the claim beyond presentation quality. Evaluate track record, independent verification, and consistency over time. Second, monitor emotional response. If confidence alone feels persuasive, pause. Confidence is a delivery mechanism, not a guarantee. Third, examine incentives. What does the individual gain from your belief? Attention? Loyalty? Money? Influence? Fourth, diversify authority sources. Relying on a single high-status figure increases vulnerability. Comparing perspectives restores balance. Healthy authority tolerates scrutiny. Manufactured authority resists it. True expertise invites questions. Status hacking discourages them subtly. The final insight is this: status is not power. Perceived status creates temporary power. When perception shifts, the power dissolves. Dark psychology does not require extraordinary intelligence. It requires understanding that humans read signals quickly and verify slowly. If you slow verification, signals dominate. If you strengthen verification, signals weaken. Status hacking works because it exploits our evolutionary shortcuts. Awareness does not eliminate those shortcuts, but it gives you the option to override them. Chapter 9. Language as a Control System. How words restructure perception. Without you noticing, most people believe language is a tool for communication. In reality, language is a tool for orientation. It does not simply describe reality. It frames it. It filters it. It assigns boundaries to it. And once boundaries are set, perception follows. Dark influence does not always rely on lies. It often relies on framing. Framing is the act of defining context before evaluation begins. If someone says, "We're facing a crisis," your nervous system activates differently than if they say, "We're facing a challenge." The underlying facts may be identical. The interpretive lens changes. Language modifies emotional baseline. An emotional baseline modifies decision-making. One of the most powerful linguistic tactics is presupposition. Presupposition embeds an assumption inside a question or statement, so that the assumption is not directly examined. For example, how will you fix the mistake? The sentence presupposes there was a mistake. Why are you resisting growth? The sentence presupposes resistance. When presuppositions are delivered smoothly, the brain processes the surface meaning and skips evaluating the hidden premise. It feels like conversation, but the frame has already shifted. Another subtle mechanism is pacing and leading. Pacing involves stating obvious truths to build agreement momentum. You care about your future. You want stability. You value security. Each statement is easy to accept. Once agreement rhythm is established, the speaker introduces a new directive. That's why this decision makes sense. The brain, having entered agreement mode, transitions smoothly into compliance. This works because agreement is state-based. When you say yes repeatedly, your body aligns with cooperative posture. Shifting into disagreement requires a state change. Skilled communicators reduce friction during that shift. There's also the compression technique. Complex issues are condensed into emotionally charged labels: corrupt, elite, victim, patriot, threat. Compression eliminates nuance. Once a label is assigned, cognitive processing simplifies. Labels act as shortcuts. Instead of analyzing behavior, the brain retrieves the meaning attached to the word. This saves energy. It also reduces independent evaluation. Binary framing amplifies this effect. If you're not with us, you're against us. There are only two options. You either care or you don't. Binary structures eliminate middle ground. The brain prefers clarity to ambiguity. When forced into a binary, most people choose the option that preserves identity alignment. Identity is central. Language that fuses belief with identity increases resistance to reconsideration. You're the kind of person who, people like us, real leaders, these phrases move discussion from evidence to self-concept. When self-concept is involved, disagreement feels personal. The nervous system responds defensively. Another advanced tactic is future pacing. Instead of arguing in the present, the speaker projects a vivid future scenario. Imagine where you'll be in a year if you don't act. Picture the regret you'll feel. Future imagery activates emotional simulation networks. The imagined scenario can feel as real as a current event. Decisions are then made to avoid imagined discomfort. Language becomes predictive control. One of the least discussed linguistic levers is ambiguity. Ambiguous statements allow listeners to fill in meaning based on their own beliefs. This is about freedom. This is about fairness. This is about protection. Each person interprets these words differently, but agreement forms because the abstraction is wide enough to include multiple projections. Ambiguity increases buy-in. It feels inclusive while remaining strategically undefined. There is also emotional stacking. Stacking layers several emotionally aligned words in sequence to amplify impact. Dangerous, reckless, irresponsible behavior. Each adjective compounds intensity. The listener rarely isolates each term for evaluation. The accumulation creates weight. Weight influences judgment. Language also controls tempo. Fast delivery with urgency suppresses analysis. Slow, deliberate speech increases perceived gravity. Strategic pauses imply significance. The brain interprets pacing as meaning. Silence can be persuasive. One more subtle mechanism is normalization. This is what everyone is realizing. It's obvious now. People are waking up. Normalization reduces perceived risk of agreement. Humans are social. Aligning with perceived majority feels safe. Even when the majority is implied rather than verified, the effect holds. Why does language exert such influence? Because humans think in narrative structures. Words create story architecture. Once inside a narrative, contradictory information is filtered or reinterpreted to preserve coherence. Dark psychology does not always inject false facts. It builds story frameworks. If the framework feels consistent, individual inconsistencies are tolerated. The defense against linguistic manipulation is not hypersuspicion. It is structural listening. Listen for hidden assumptions. Identify labels replacing analysis. Notice when binaries remove nuance. Observe emotional intensity rising faster than evidence. Ask neutralizing questions internally. What is being assumed? What alternative frames exist? What evidence supports this label? Slowing language slows influence. Language is not inherently manipulative. It is the primary tool of human coordination. But when used strategically without transparency, it becomes an architecture of perception, and perception guides action. The most powerful communicators do not control your thoughts. They control your frames. Once the frame shifts, you often move willingly. Understanding this does not make you immune, but allows you to step outside the narrative before it closes around you. Chapter 10. Micro-commitments. How small agreements rewire identity. Most people believe manipulation happens in big moments. A dramatic pitch, a heated argument, a bold promise. But large decisions rarely appear without preparation. The real leverage often lies in something smaller. Micro-commitments. A micro-commitment is a tiny agreement that feels insignificant at the time. It requires little effort. It seems harmless. It may even feel aligned with your values. But small agreements change internal alignment, and internal alignment shapes identity. Human beings strive for consistency. Once we publicly or privately commit to something, even in a minor way, the brain begins adjusting self-perception to match that commitment. If you say, "I support this idea," you start seeing yourself as someone who supports it. If you click join, you begin identify with the group. If you repost a message, you become psychologically invested in its credibility. Micro-commitments do not force behavior. They initiate alignment. Alignment deepens over time. The power lies in escalation. A low-cost action is introduced first. A comment, a like, a small favor. Once that action is completed, a slightly larger one follows. Each step feels only marginally different from the previous one. You rarely notice the cumulative shift. This mechanism is rooted in cognitive dissonance theory. When behavior and identity diverge, the brain experiences tension. To reduce tension, beliefs adjust to justify behavior. It is easier to adjust belief than to admit inconsistency. So after repeated small actions, the internal narrative changes. I've already supported this several times. I must believe in it. I'm the kind of person who stands by this. The commitment becomes self-reinforcing. Micro-commitments also work socially. Public alignment increases pressure to remain consistent. Once others associate you with a stance or a group, changing position carries reputational cost. Consistency feels honorable. Inconsistency feels unstable. Manipulative systems leverage this by encouraging visible small agreements early. Sign this, share this, say this out loud, wear this symbol. None of these actions seem transformative individually, but identity is shaped through repetition. There is also a neurological component. Completing small actions provides minor reward signals. Even something as simple as clicking or responding can release subtle dopamine reinforcement. Completion feels satisfying. That satisfaction strengthens behavioral pathways. The more often you act in a direction, the more natural it feels to continue. Another subtle tactic involves progressive moral framing. Initial commitments are framed in universally agreeable terms. Do you believe in fairness? Do you care about your family? Do you want safety? Almost everyone says yes. Later, those abstract agreements are connected to specific directives. You believe in fairness, so you should support this. You care about safety, so you must oppose that. The original commitment is leveraged to justify more concrete positions. Because you agreed earlier, resistance now feels contradictory. Micro-commitments also reduce exit probability. Once someone has invested time, energy, or reputation into a path, leaving becomes psychologically costly. Even minimal investment can trigger the sunk cost effect. People continue participating because they do not want previous effort to feel wasted. Dark psychology does not always demand loyalty. It builds it incrementally. The danger is not in agreeing once. It is in failing to track trajectory. A healthy environment allows reevaluation without penalty. It encourages reflection and permits reversal. Manipulative environments discourage withdrawal. They interpret hesitation as betrayal. They reinterpret doubt as weakness. This increases internal pressure to remain aligned. To defend against micro-commitment manipulation, awareness must focus on pattern, not event. Ask yourself, is each step increasing my autonomy or reducing it? Is my identity becoming more flexible or more rigid? Would I feel safe changing my mind publicly? If the answer to the last question is no, the system may be leveraging identity lock-in. Another defense is intentional pause before public alignment. Public commitments carry greater psychological weight than private ones. Delay reduces emotional momentum. You can also practice explicit reevaluation. Periodically reassess positions and affiliations. Consciously update beliefs when evidence shifts. Normalizing change protects cognitive flexibility. The most powerful micro-commitment is not the first agreement. It is a silent decision to stop questioning. Once questioning fades, identity hardens. Hard identity resists evidence. Soft identity adapts. Manipulation prefers hardened identity because hardened identity defends itself automatically. Micro-commitments are not inherently malicious. They are part of everyday social coordination. Promises, agreements, shared goals. These are foundational to cooperation. The distinction lies in transparency. Are commitments informed? Are they reversible? Is dissent allowed without penalty? If yes, the structure is healthy. If no, small steps may be leading somewhere you did not intend to go. The most effective manipulation rarely feels like pressure. It feels like momentum. And momentum, once established, is difficult to stop. Chapter 11. Shame Engineering, the quietest form of control. Fear can control you, but shame can own you. Fear is external. Shame is internal. When fear disappears, behavior often resets. When shame is installed, control continues even in the absence of the controller. Shame engineering is a strategic use of social disapproval, humiliation, or moral framing to regulate behavior without direct force. It does not require yelling. It does not require threats. It requires exposure. Humans evolved in small tribes where reputation determined survival. Social exclusion meant vulnerability. Because of this, the brain developed acute sensitivity to signals of rejection. Neuroscientific research shows that social rejection activates neural circuits similar to physical pain. Being excluded does not merely hurt emotionally, it registers biologically. Shame leverages that system. Unlike guilt, which focuses on behavior, shame targets identity. Guilt says, you did something wrong. Shame says, you are something wrong. That difference matters. Guilt can motivate repair. Shame destabilizes the self. When shame attaches to identity, individuals begin self-surveillance. They monitor their words, tone, posture, and even thoughts to avoid social penalty. External control becomes internal policing. Modern environments amplify this mechanism. Digital platforms allow rapid collective judgment. A misstep can be broadcast instantly. Social validation systems, likes, comments, visibility, reinforce conformity. Public shaming creates a powerful deterrent effect. Even observing others being shamed can modify behavior. You do not need to be targeted directly. Witnessing social punishment increases caution. Shame spreads through anticipation. If someone sees a person criticized or ridiculed for a viewpoint, they may silence themselves preemptively. The cost of expression feels high. This is strategic. Shame engineering does not always silence through force. It reshapes the cost-benefit calculation of authenticity. Another layer involves moral amplification. When disagreement is framed not as difference of opinion, but as moral failure, intensity increases. You're irresponsible. You're dangerous. You're selfish. You're ignorant. These labels do more than challenge ideas. They threaten belonging. Once belonging feels threatened, the nervous system activates defensively. The individual may either conform or retaliate. Both reactions increase polarization. Shame also works through ambiguity. Sometimes the rules are not clearly stated. Instead, they are implied through reaction, a subtle shift in tone, a withdrawal of warmth, a sarcastic remark. The individual infers a boundary. Ambiguity increases anxiety. When rules are unclear, people overcorrect. They become hypervigilant to avoid further missteps. Hypervigilance drains cognitive energy. Drained individuals seek stability. Stability often comes from conformity. In intimate relationships, shame engineering can appear as recurring criticism disguised as guidance. I'm just trying to help you improve. Why can't you be more like, I'm embarrassed by this? Over time, The target begins associating self-expression with risk. Self-editing increases. Confidence decreases. The manipulator does not need to forbid behavior. They attach shame to it. Shame is efficient because it operates internally. Once installed, the target enforces compliance alone. In organizations, shame may appear as public comparison metrics, rankings displayed openly, failures highlighted more than progress. Employees internalize performance anxiety. Anxiety reduces creativity, but increases conformity. Shame narrows experimentation. There's also group-based shame. Collective identity can be weaponized. If you really cared about this community, people like us don't act that way. The individual fears being seen as a traitor to shared values. Again, identity becomes a lever. The long-term consequence of sustained shame exposure is fragmentation. Individuals split between authentic impulse and socially acceptable persona. This internal division increases stress and reduces clarity. When authenticity feels unsafe, strategic performance replaces it. Performance sustains control. Defending against shame engineering requires differentiation, separate behavior from identity. Recognize when critique crosses into character attack. Notice patterns of repeated humiliation disguised as correction. It also requires tolerance for discomfort. You cannot avoid all disapproval. Seeking universal approval creates dependency. When disapproval becomes survivable, shame loses leverage. Healthy communities correct behavior without attacking identity. They allow mistakes without permanent labeling. Unhealthy systems attach permanent narratives to temporary actions. Another powerful defense is private integrity. When your self-evaluation is grounded in personal standards rather than fluctuating external validation, external shame weakens. Self-trust reduces compliance driven by fear of humiliation. Shame is not inherently destructive. It can signal misalignment with personal values. But engineered shame is different. It is strategically applied to reduce autonomy. The quietest control is the one that feels self-generated. When you believe you are correcting yourself freely, you stop looking for influence. That is why shame is so powerful. It does not feel like control. It feels like conscience. Understanding the difference restores agency. Chapter 12. Digital hostage tactics, urgency, isolation, and engineered panic. In the physical world, hostage situations are dramatic. In the digital world, they are subtle. No one ties you to a chair. No one locks a door. Instead, they lock your attention. They compress your time. They isolate your verification. And for a short window, you become cognitively trapped. Digital hostage tactics do not rely on physical force. They rely on urgency architecture. The pattern is consistent. Create emotional shock. Impose time pressure. Discourage outside contact. Demand immediate action. The moment shock hits, your nervous system activates. Heart rate increases. Breathing shifts. Cortisol rises. Under stress, analytical processing declines, and reactive processing increases. This is not weakness. It is biology. If someone tells you that your bank account is compromised, that a loved one is in danger, or that an opportunity will vanish within minutes, your body responds before your mind fully evaluates. That physiological spike narrows cognitive bandwidth. Narrow bandwidth reduces skepticism. The next move is isolation. You can't tell anyone. Stay on the line. Don't verify this yet. This must remain confidential. Isolation prevents external calibration. When alone under pressure, your brain relies on the information available inside the interaction. Without alternative perspectives, the manipulator controls the informational environment. Control the environment, control the frame. Another layer involves authority simulation. Digital attackers often mimic institutions, banks, law enforcement, executives, support teams. They replicate logos, language patterns, formal tone, even synthetic voices that sound official. Authority reduces resistance. If the request appears to come from a legitimate system, your default assumption shifts from suspicion to compliance. Authority plus urgency plus isolation creates a cognitive tunnel. Inside that tunnel, decision speed increases and evaluation depth decreases. There's also emotional personalization. Messages are tailored to your context, your name, your recent activity, your workplace, your online behavior. Personal relevance increases believability. When information appears specific, the brain assigns higher credibility. Specificity feels authentic. Modern digital environments allow attackers to gather fragments of public data and assemble convincing narratives. The result is not random deception. It is targeted plausibility. Another tactic involves escalation layering. The first request is small. Confirm identity. Click a link. Provide minor information. Once engagement occurs, the next request increases in risk. Each step builds momentum. Momentum reduces pause. The psychological trap deepens when fear of loss becomes primary. Loss aversion is powerful. People are more motivated to prevent losses than to achieve equivalent gains. Threatening access to money, reputation, or relationships triggers disproportionate urgency. The individual becomes focused on stopping harm rather than verifying claims. Stopping harm feels like the priority. Verification feels secondary. In many cases, digital hostage tactics also include emotional intimidation. You could be charged. Your account will be frozen. Your job is at risk. Fear of authority consequences suppresses confrontation. The deeper strategy is simple. Collapse your decision window. When the window is small, your prefrontal cortex has less time to evaluate inconsistencies. You default to compliance patterns learned from legitimate authority structures. We are trained from childhood to respond quickly to authority instructions. Digital systems exploit that training. The most unsettling dimension is that these tactics often work not because people are naive, but because they are overloaded. Constant notifications, rapid communication cycles, and multitasking reduce baseline attentional stability. When a high-intensity message enters that environment, it stands out sharply. Contrast increases impact. Defense begins with recognizing the sequence. Shock, urgency, isolation, authority, escalation. If two or more of these elements appear simultaneously, pause becomes mandatory. Time restores cognition. A simple rule can interrupt the trap. No irreversible decision under pressure. Legitimate institutions rarely require secrecy combined with immediate irreversible action. Another defense is external verification. Break isolation deliberately. Call the institution directly using official contact information. Consult a trusted person. Open a separate channel. Isolation sustains manipulation. Connection disrupts it. Emotional regulation also matters. Slowing breathing, grounding physically, or stepping away from the device reduces physiological activation. When arousal drops, evaluation returns. Digital hostage tactics depend on your nervous system remaining elevated. Calm is resistance. It is important to understand that these strategies are not confined to financial scams. They appear in workplace pressure, online communities, political messaging, and social conflicts. Any environment that demands instant alignment while discouraging reflection may be compressing your cognitive space. Freedom requires space. Space to question. Space to verify. Space to decline. The digital world accelerates interaction. Acceleration increases vulnerability. Deliberate slowing restores agency. You are rarely physically trapped, but attention can be captured. Time can be compressed. Perception can be narrowed. When you recognize the architecture of digital hostage tactics, the tunnel widens. And once the tunnel widens, you can step out. Chapter 13. Immunity protocols becoming expensive to manipulate. You cannot eliminate influence from your life. Influence is constant. Persuasion is everywhere. Pressure is part of social existence. The goal is not isolation. The goal is immunity. Not perfect immunity. Adaptive immunity. To become difficult to manipulate. You do not need paranoia. You need structure. Manipulation succeeds when cognition is overloaded, emotion is elevated, and time is compressed. Immunity is built by reversing those conditions deliberately. The first protocol is state regulation. Your nervous system is the gatekeeper of your judgment. When it is dysregulated, your decision quality drops. Stress narrows perspective. Anger accelerates conclusions. Fear increases compliance. Learning to downregulate quickly is not self-help advice. It is cognitive defense. Slow breathing stabilizes physiological arousal. Physical grounding restores present awareness. Stepping away from stimulus interrupts momentum. A calm nervous system widens evaluation bandwidth. Bandwidth is leverage. The second protocol is delay discipline. Urgency is one of the most reliable manipulation tools. When someone insists on immediate action, the safest move is strategic pause. Delay does not mean avoidance. It means regaining cognitive control. Institutions that are legitimate can withstand verification. People who are secure can tolerate boundaries. Opportunities that are real do not vanish because you ask questions. Delay weakens artificial scarcity. The third protocol is multi-source verification. Single-source environments increase distortion risk. When information comes from one dominant channel, perception narrows. Actively seek independent confirmation. Compare narratives from credible but diverse perspectives. Notice where they overlap and where they diverge. Consensus across independent sources increases reliability. The fourth protocol is incentive analysis. Every message has a direction. Someone benefits if you believe it. Ask, what does the sender gain from my agreement? Is there financial incentive? Reputational leverage? Ideological expansion? Incentive awareness clarifies motive without requiring hostility. The fifth protocol is identity flexibility. Rigid identity increases vulnerability. When belief becomes fused with self-concept, updating feels threatening. Practice separating ideas from identity. You can change your mind without losing yourself. You can revise beliefs without betraying your values. Flexibility protects autonomy. The sixth protocol is boundary clarity. Manipulation often succeeds through ambiguity. Vague expectations, emotional pressure, and undefined obligations create confusion. Clear boundaries reduce confusion. Define what you will and will not accept. Communicate limits calmly. Observe reactions. Healthy systems adjust. Exploitative systems escalate. Reaction to boundaries reveals structure. The seventh protocol is exposure management. Constant stimulation lowers discernment. Continuous scrolling, rapid notifications, and emotional headlines create chronic activation. Chronic activation reduces skepticism. Limit exposure to high-intensity content. Schedule deliberate information intake. Create technology-free intervals. Mental space strengthens judgment. The eighth protocol is discomfort tolerance. You must be willing to endure short-term discomfort to avoid long-term exploitation, disappointment, social disapproval, temporary uncertainty. If these experiences feel unbearable, you become easier to steer. Resilience is not the absence of discomfort. It is the ability to remain stable within it. The ninth protocol is question training. Train yourself to ask neutral, clarifying questions automatically. What evidence supports this? What assumptions are embedded here? What alternative explanations exist? Question slow narratives. Slower narratives reduce impulsive alignment. The 10th protocol is value anchoring. Manipulation often exploits emotional spikes. If your decisions are anchored in clearly defined personal values, spikes lose force. Write your principles explicitly. Review them periodically. Use them as filters. Values provide stability when information fluctuates. The 11th protocol is humility calibration. Overconfidence increases susceptibility. When you believe you are immune to manipulation, your guard lowers. Accept that you are influenceable. Everyone is. Humility maintains vigilance without paranoia. The 12th protocol is social diversity. Engage with people who think differently but reason well. Exposure to thoughtful disagreement sharpens cognitive flexibility. Echo chambers weaken immunity. Diverse dialogue strengthens it. The final protocol is reflection. Periodically review your recent decisions. Were they rushed? Were they emotionally charged? Were they socially pressured? Self-audit strengthens future resistance. Immunity is not built once. It is maintained. It is not dramatic. It is procedural. You do not need extraordinary intelligence to become difficult to manipulate. You need structured awareness. Manipulators look for speed, reactivity, isolation, and rigidity. If you cultivate calm, delay, connection, and flexibility, you increase the cost of deception. And when the cost rises, many manipulators move on. Autonomy is not loud. It is disciplined. Chapter 14. Power without predation. Ethical influence that still hits hard. There's a dangerous myth surrounding influence. The myth says you must choose. Either you manipulate or you remain powerless. Either you dominate or you are dominated. This binary is false. Influence itself is neutral. It becomes dark when it removes agency. It becomes ethical when it expands it. The goal is not to avoid influence. That is impossible. The goal is to wield it without predation. Predatory influence compresses choice. Ethical influence clarifies choice. The difference lies in transparency, consent, and long-term consequence. Dark influence hides intent. Ethical influence states intent. Dark influence pressures urgency. Ethical influence allows pause. Dark influence exploits emotional spikes. Ethical influence respects emotional state. Power without predation begins with alignment. If you want to persuade someone, the first question is not, how do I get compliance? It is this outcome beneficial for them as well? Mutual benefit changes structure. When outcomes are asymmetric, coercion becomes tempting. When outcomes are shared, clarity increases. Ethical influence does not avoid strength. It uses clarity instead of concealment. Clarity can be powerful. Stating your position directly, explaining reasoning openly, inviting scrutiny without defensiveness. These behaviors build trust. Trust compounds. Predatory tactics often achieve faster results. Fear accelerates compliance. Scarcity triggers action. Social pressure silences objection. But acceleration comes with decay. Trust erodes. Reputation destabilizes. Relationships weaken. Ethical influence moves slower initially, but it builds structural stability. There is also a neurological component. When someone feels coerced, their threat system activates. Even if they comply, resistance builds internally. That resistance often surfaces later as withdrawal, sabotage, or exit. When someone feels respected, their threat system remains calmer. Cooperation becomes voluntary. Voluntary cooperation lasts longer. Strong influence without predation relies on three principles. First, informed agreement. Ensure the person understands the implications of the decision. No hidden costs. No disguised trade-offs. Second, reversibility. Where possible, allow exit without humiliation. Trapping someone may secure short-term loyalty but destroys long-term respect. Third, proportionality. Do not escalate pressure beyond what the situation warrants. Overamplification of fear or urgency creates distrust. Ethical influence also involves emotional regulation. If you are dysregulated, your influence will reflect it. Anger, insecurity, and ego-driven need for control distort communication. Regulation produces precision. Precision increases credibility. Another key difference lies in identity respect. Predatory influence fuses compliance with worth. If you cared, you would. If you were smart, you'd agree. Ethical influence separates choice from value. You may disagree. Here's why I see it this way. This preserves dignity. Dignity strengthens trust. There is a paradox here. When you do not attempt to control others aggressively, your influence often increases. People trust those who do not appear desperate for control. Calm conviction is persuasive. Desperation signals insecurity. Ethical influence is not softness. It can be firm. It can set boundaries. It can reject manipulation attempts directly, but it does so without humiliation. Boundaries without contempt maintain power, without corruption. In leadership, this matters profoundly. Leaders who rely on fear may achieve obedience. Leaders who cultivate respect achieve alignment. Obedience collapses when authority weakens. Alignment persists. Influence becomes dark when it treats people as tools. It becomes ethical when it treats people as agents. Agents can choose. Choice preserves dignity. Dignity preserves stability. The deepest layer of power without predation is internal. If you require domination to feel secure, you will drift toward manipulation. If you are secure in your own values and capacity, you can persuade without coercion. Security reduces the need to control. The future will not reward those who can manipulate most aggressively. It will reward those who can build trust in unstable environments. Trust will become rare. Rare assets increase in value. Ethical influence is not weakness in competitive systems. It is strategic longevity. Predators burn ecosystems. Builders sustain them. The question is not whether you will influence. You will. The question is whether your influence will create dependency or capability. One extracts. The other expands. Choose expansion. Chapter 15. The new code, autonomy in an engineered world. You were not designed for this environment. No human nervous system was. We evolved in tribes of limited size. We process information slowly. We verified through direct experience. Now perception is programmable. Attention is monetized. Identity is targeted. Emotion is amplified at scale. The old rules no longer apply. In the past, survival depended on physical awareness. Today, survival depends on cognitive awareness. The final truth of dark psychology is not that the world is controlled by hidden masterminds. It is that systems now exist which can influence at speed, scale, and precision beyond what our instinct evolved to handle. This is not paranoia. It is structural reality. Your feeds are optimized. Your notifications are calibrated. Your exposure is filtered. Your reactions are tracked. And the more reactive you are, the more predictable you become. Predictability is leverage. The new code for autonomy begins with one principle. Stability is power. In a reactive environment, the calm person holds disproportionate advantage. When others are triggered, you evaluate. When others rush, you delay. When others polarize, you observe. Calm is not passivity. It is control over timing. Timing determines influence. The second principle is narrative awareness. You are constantly inside stories. Stories about politics. Stories about success. Stories about masculinity, morality, status, identity. Most people do not realize they are inside a narrative until they defend it. Autonomy requires stepping outside the story long enough to examine its structure. Who benefits from this framing? What emotions does it amplify? What behaviors does it encourage? If a narrative consistently pushes urgency, outrage, or division, it may be engineered for engagement rather than accuracy. The third principle is identity sovereignty. When identity becomes fused with ideology, flexibility disappears. If you cannot question a belief without feeling destabilized, that belief has moved from opinion to identity anchor. Identity anchors are powerful. They can guide you, or they can trap you. Sovereignty means your identity is larger than any single idea. You are not your stance. You are not your group. You are not your algorithmic reflection. You are the agent choosing among them. The fourth principle is verification culture. Trust should not be blind, but it should not be permanently broken either. Autonomy thrives when verification is normalized. Verify calmly. Cross-check without aggression. Seek evidence without humiliation. The more people normalize verification, the weaker deception becomes. Truth is not self-sustaining. It requires maintenance. The fifth principle is disciplined attention. Attention is the new currency. Where you direct it shapes your worldview. What you repeatedly consume becomes familiar. What becomes familiar feels true. If you do not choose your inputs deliberately, they will be chosen for you. Autonomy requires intentional exposure. The sixth principle is resilience to discomfort. Manipulation works by offering relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from loneliness. Relief from ambiguity. If you can tolerate uncertainty without rushing toward the first stabilizing explanation, your autonomy strengthens. Ambiguity is not weakness. It is space for evaluation. The seventh principle is community design. Isolation increases susceptibility. Healthy connection increases clarity. Surround yourself with people who value evidence, who tolerate disagreement, who prioritize long-term stability over short-term emotional spikes. Community shapes cognition. The final principle is conscious influence. You are not only a target of influence, you are a source of it. Your words, your tone, your framing, your reactions, all these affect others. If you spread urgency without verification, you amplify chaos. If you share outrage without context, you reinforce division. If you reward sensationalism with attention, you strengthen it. Autonomy is not only about defense. It is about responsibility. The engineered world is not disappearing. Synthetic media will improve. Algorithms will refine. Psychological tactics will evolve, but so can awareness. Dark psychology thrives in invisibility. When mechanisms are exposed, they weaken. You cannot stop all manipulation. You cannot eliminate all distortion, but you can increase the cost of influencing you irresponsibly. You can become slower to trigger, harder to isolate, more flexible in identity, more disciplined in attention. The new code is not secret. It is simple. Regulate your state. Question the frame. Protect your time. Diversify your inputs. Value truth over speed. Value dignity over dominance. In an engineered world, the greatest rebellion is clarity, and clarity begins with one decision. You will not outsource your thinking.